Welcome back into the 14. I'm your host, Chris Lee, alongside Blake Lovell. Blake, it is almost mid-February. That's when things get really interesting in college basketball. Certainly many interesting storylines to talk about with the SEC. And let's start with this. Joe Lunardi's bracket has come out, and he has got right now 6 SEC teams in it. I would say I feel pretty good about 3 or 4. The last 2, I'm not so sure how solid a ground they're going to be on. What are your thoughts on where the SEC stands in terms of the big dance?
Well, I think that it's a lot more sort of, I don't know, I don't think there's a lot set in stone here when it comes to kind of where a lot of these SEC teams are right now. For me, Alabama, Missouri, I think are fine unless, we always add the caveat. I think you always have to remember, unless these teams were to lose out or really just lose a lot of games the rest of the way, because we've still got a pretty good chunk of games to play. So I don't know that anyone's just a complete lock at this point, but I think Alabama and Missouri are pretty much as close as it gets, because Alabama's the number 2 seed in Lunardi's bracket, Missouri's at number 3. Everyone else, I think there's still, a lot to be determined on that. Yes, even for a team like Tennessee, I think at number 4, because we've seen Tennessee. They've been very inconsistent. We've talked about it. I think they're going to be fine. I mean, I just don't foresee Tennessee just completely losing out and falling out of the tournament. So those 3 teams probably look at and say everything's okay right now for those. But then everyone else, the other half of that field right now, Arkansas, Florida, LSU, I think all 3 of those teams still, have some work to do. They have to be able to have a pretty strong finish to feel really good about their chances to where maybe they're not going into the SEC tournament needing to win some games. So I don't think by any means are any of those 3 guaranteed, but I do think we wind up probably getting a mixture somewhere, probably 5 to 6 teams in the SEC, and I really don't know that anyone beyond that right now, unless, again, just a stellar run, someone like an Ole Miss may have a chance, but it looks like probably 6 is probably the best the SEC is probably going to get.
A pet peeve of mine in terms of tournament projections is the use of the word lock. I mean, nobody's a lock right now. I mean, I think you're a lock when you could lose every game on your remaining schedule, including your conference tournament opener, and then you get in, and then you're a lock. So by that definition, nobody is a lock. But I'm with you. It's hard to see a scenario where Alabama, Missouri, and Tennessee fall out. Now, Missouri to me is an interesting case because Lunardi's got Missouri at 3. You look at the net ranking, the Tigers at 25, so there's a bit of a disconnect there. But then you look into who Missouri has beaten, and that's kind of your explanation. And that's why I think Missouri, despite the net ranking of not where you'd expect it for a 3 seed, is going to end up in a great position, barring some sort of disaster between now and mid-March.
Yeah, I mean, they've easily got the best non-conference resume of anybody in the SEC. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, they beat Illinois, who, right now looks like a national title contender at this point. They've beaten, Oregon. That was a good win. They've won at Arkansas. They've won at Tennessee. Now they've beaten Alabama. I think Missouri does at this point when you just look at it overall. Their resume is very impressive. And so, the net rankings, we always talk about it too. I don't know how much, you can look into that sometimes. I mean, obviously it's a huge factor when it comes to the selection part of it, but there are some things too outside of just being able to determine what those rankings are that maybe that they don't completely tell. And I just think when you look at Missouri, I mean, it's a team that's lost 3 games. They're in a situation where I think that they're going to be fine, and it's hard to believe, I know, for a lot of people, but they are sitting in a really good spot. And really, if they finish pretty strong here, again, I would not be surprised if we're going into March saying, hey, there's the team that has the absolute best resume of any team in the SEC, even maybe more so than Alabama.
Alabama has an interesting resume because Alabama is 5-1 in quad 1, but you start digging in a little bit and not a lot of, I guess, top heaviness within that group. I guess, is that a fair way to say it? I mean, Alabama's best win is over Tennessee. I think that barring something crazy, Baylor and Gonzaga are going to have locks on 2 of the 1 seeds. Is Alabama maxed out as a 2, maybe boring, going unbeaten? And, well, I should say you would have to go unbeaten, but it's hard for me to see a path for Alabama to get to a one that doesn't include winning maybe all but one of the remaining games, including a sweep of the SEC tournament. Is that a fair way to put it? I mean, I think if Alabama goes out early in the conference tournament, you can put that to bed. But to me, it's harder to see Alabama cracking in that top group. I think the Crimson Tide probably settle into 2 or 3 here, but am I overthinking this, Blake?
Well, I mean, that's the thing is to think about is, that I guess that's if Alabama actually plays in the conference tournament too, which we'll have that discussion down the road, because they may be one of those teams that don't have a lot to gain from actually playing in the conference tournament. The next 2 weeks they have no games on their schedule that's going to do them any favors, and I think that's the thing is you can go 4-0 in these games against South Carolina, Georgia, Texas A&M, and Vanderbilt. It's going to mean absolutely nothing. So I think you have much more to lose if you're Alabama over the next couple of weeks in terms of playing for a potential, number one seed if all things considered you win out. Because if you lose any of these games, then I think you're immediately dropping yourself down, like we said, to a much different level. Really, the only game left on their schedule that's going to do anything for them, I think, from a resume standpoint, is going to be at Arkansas on February 24th. And that's it. Like the rest of the games, Mississippi State, unless Mississippi State makes a run, not going to do anything for them. Auburn, unless Auburn makes a run, which, again, we know Auburn's not going to be a tournament team, I still think they'll be judged based on their quality by the tournament committee in terms of the teams that are going to be getting in, that maybe have beaten them or lost to them. But that's it. Like Arkansas's only game is going to mean anything here the rest of the way. And so I think that's probably more dangerous for Alabama than anything because, as we said, someone like Missouri still has some potential ground they can make up there because they've got some games against teams that are pretty good. Whereas, you look at this, and I think for Alabama, their resume at this point is interesting because, they have beaten, look, we know they started 9-0 in SEC play. They've beaten tournament teams like Tennessee, Florida, Arkansas. They've beaten LSU, beaten Kentucky twice. But we've got to remember, those 2 Kentucky wins don't mean anything this year. Like they have no value at all. So I think that's something to consider as well. And they've got the 3 losses they had in non-conference play to Stanford, Clemson, Western Kentucky. I think, some of those teams are going to get into the tournament, but still, it's just, I don't know. It's hard to kind of judge maybe where they're at because I think they wind up around that 2 spot. I don't necessarily know that they have enough quality opportunities left to get to a 1, but it does seem like they're going to settle into that 2 or 3 if again they don't lose some of these games, these teams they shouldn't lose to.
Arkansas is a team that I think at this point it's impossible to judge. And I think it doesn't matter anyway, right? Because it really doesn't matter where Arkansas is right now. Arkansas is either going to play its way in or play its way out. Right now, the Razorbacks don't have a win over anybody that I see being NCAA tournament worthy, barring one of the teams that it beat out of conference.
Yeah.
Winning its conference tournament and getting in that way, but that's different than earning an at-large type bid. But I think this plays out for them one way or the other because Arkansas has 4 teams left on the schedule that I think have got a good chance to get into the tournament, that being Missouri on the road, Florida at home, Alabama at home, and LSU at home. So I guess that's good if you're Arkansas. 3 of those are at home. Does Arkansas, though, have to win probably at least 2 of those 4, Blake? Because, again, when you start digging into the resume in terms of quality wins, they're just not there. Now, Arkansas did come close to Tennessee and the same against Oklahoma State, but at some point you've got to beat people. So am I fair to – is it fair to say that they've got to get at least a couple of those unless they can get a couple against a Florida or an Alabama or a Tennessee in the SEC tournament?
You said it completely right because I think you have to beat teams at some point. Like when we start having these conversations about the NCAA tournament, like you can't just keep losing to all the good teams and beat all the bad teams and feel like you're in a good spot. And I think that's exactly kind of where Arkansas is right now. Is they've lost to 5 teams who are going to be NCAA tournament teams, but they've beaten. I guess right now, they've probably at this point beaten 2 NCAA tournament teams, and I think that would be Abilene Christian and North Texas. Like I think, and again, what's that going to mean versus it's flipping that and beating a Missouri or an Alabama or an LSU or teams like that. Completely different situation. So they have to put themselves in a spot here, and we'll talk about their game. I can talk to you in a little bit, but the fact is they get Missouri, Florida, Alabama, LSU. I think for Arkansas, if you want to feel good and not necessarily be on that bubble spot heading into the SEC tournament. You've got to win a couple of those games, I think, against those teams. If you can win two of those games, let's say against that group of four of Missouri, Florida, Alabama, and LSU, I think they're going to be in great shape. Like Arkansas will be fine. I think they'll get in, maybe even settle into like a 7. I don't know if 6 is even possible. They could probably get there if they put together enough wins against some of those really good teams. But otherwise, I think they're still at a point where they just can't keep losing to good teams. They've got to beat one of these teams eventually, and of course, it goes without saying, you've got to avoid losses too on the road against A&M and South Carolina, which are not going to be easy games. So they have to take care of their business against those two teams. But then I think they've got to find a way to get some wins here. And this Kentucky game looming ahead, that's something too. That is could be one where if they drop that one, then I think that conversation sort of amps up a little bit in terms of, okay, now Arkansas really needs to beat maybe even 3 of those teams from Missouri, Florida, Alabama, LSU.
Tennessee is in that group with Missouri where I think you could safely characterize it as would really have to screw things up not to get into the big dance.
Yeah.
Neither team has got a loss outside the quad one. And Tennessee, I mean, boy, the Vols have banked some pretty good wins, Blake. I mean, Colorado, I know that was at home, but still the Buffaloes are going to be an easy lock for the NCAA tournament the way they're playing if they continue. Probably a top 4 or 5 seed. You've got Missouri on the road. That was a big win. You've got also Kansas, and I know it's not Kansas of old, but still that's a tournament type team. The Vols are going to have some more chances against LSU. We'll talk about the Tigers in a minute. Not other than that, not much though, but I think Tennessee, I look at it and say that's a tournament team based on what it's done. And I just don't see the Vols messing it up. Again, not a lot of chances to add marquee wins between now and the end of the regular season, but games that Tennessee should win. And if Tennessee just wins the games it should win, I think that's going to be a team that heading into the tournament in Nashville really won't have to do a lot more. It'll just be playing for seeding at that point.
Yeah, I think Tennessee's fine too. I think they're going to be okay, because we've talked about it before. They don't have the schedule that some of these other teams have left, and you would think they should be able to win the majority of their games the rest of the season. And I think if they do that, they'll be fine. And, because that's the thing is we have to go back to, you mentioned Colorado. Like, that was the first game of the season for Tennessee, but that was like, almost mid-December at this point based on kind of where they were at. So it still means something. Like, it doesn't matter that it was 2 months ago. That's a win that's still going to look good on your resume no matter what. So I think that for Tennessee, and beating Missouri and beating Arkansas and Kansas, like you said, they do have that one loss to Ole Miss. I think that's not going to look great on there, but like we said too, I mean, we talk about it. I mean, Ole Miss, like I don't think Ole Miss is going to get to that point, but they're kind of on that. What are they? I think they're 62, 63 or something in the net right now. So could Ole Miss eventually play their way into the conversation? Maybe. That's probably if you're Tennessee. You root for that because that would make that one loss right now look even better. So I think overall, though, Tennessee's going to be fine. I mean, they're going to be sitting. My guess is I can't really see unless we see this inconsistent Tennessee offense and they struggle to hit 60 over these next couple games. I just feel like Tennessee's probably going to wind up settling into that 4 or 5 seed somewhere.
Yeah, Ole Miss has got a really narrow needle to thread because Ole Miss has got a big wins problem too. I mean, it's got to win over Tennessee. That's the only team that I see that it's beaten that is likely going to make the field of 68. And then you look at what's left.
Yeah.
The one coming up on Wednesday against Missouri, that's the one they've got to win. Now, look, maybe there's volume winning. Actually, there's 2 against Missouri, so I take that back. But nobody else on the schedule that's going to get in the tournament. Now, maybe, again, you thread that needle by winning out, and at that point, that's a different discussion. But Ole Miss can't afford, if it wants to get into that discussion, to stumble very much between here and the finish line.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. They probably need to sweep Missouri. Like, that's going to be easier said than done, but they probably need to sweep those 2. And Yeah, it's probably not going to happen. So I think for them, maybe it's wishful thinking at this point, but at least they got that win against Tennessee, and maybe they can find a couple more here along the way. But really, as you said, unless you have a team like South Carolina, Mississippi State, unless they just go haywire and win out or something, aside from the games against Ole Miss, there's not enough quality win opportunities left, probably.
Florida is almost in that Tennessee, Missouri camp, if not for that disastrous finish against South Carolina last week, because now Florida's got 2 losses outside quad one. But, the win over West Virginia on the road, that was a big one last weekend. Beating Tennessee at home, and not just beating the Vols, but just hammering them in that game a couple of weeks ago. That's a big one. A win over LSU. We'll get to the Tigers in a second, but they're kind of a poor man's Tennessee or Missouri in respect that they've got some good wins. Now, what's coming up again? The opportunities against Arkansas and Missouri are really the only 2 ones for them to stand out. But I think Florida, to me, again, that's a team that unless they lose more than a couple on the way to Nashville, I don't think. I think Florida's just good enough. I like their guard play. I like what they've got inside. I have confidence in that team, despite what we saw last time out. I think Florida's going to get there, but boy, you'd like to have that Carolina game back.
That's the thing. It's like they're the most frustrating 10-5 team, it feels like, in the country, because you look around at some of these games and you're just like, all right, well, you feel like they should have won that Mississippi State game about a month ago. They should have won the game against South Carolina. But then they make up for it, by blowing out Tennessee, by winning at West Virginia. And so, yeah, I think Florida's going to be in pretty good shape too. We mentioned they're probably right outside that group in terms of where they're at right now. I think, what is it, Lenardi has them as a 7. I think they're probably going to have a chance to really make some moves in terms of moving up a bit, because I really feel like I say that and I just keep thinking about that South Carolina game. I'm like, I keep saying all this about Florida, but I'm like, man, they could come out and lose to A&M on Saturday, and all of a sudden we're having a much different conversation. But the fact is, they've still got Arkansas, they've still got Missouri on their schedule, and as we said, I mean, even a game against Auburn could mean something depending on how Auburn finishes. And look, maybe Kentucky goes on a run here, and those wins wind up looking even better for teams who beat Kentucky. So we'll see. But overall, I think Florida's probably going to be okay. But man, Chris, I'm always hesitant to say that because I feel like I've said that over the past 3 years with the Florida team, and they wind up doing something, and it's just very inconsistent. So you would think so. I know Florida fans probably not going to be very confident until they actually see their name on the NCAA tournament bracket, just based on the inconsistency sometimes. But I always go back to it. This team, I can't say that I'm surprised in terms of them kind of being up and down a little bit because, as we said before, I mean, they're playing without arguably the best player in the conference in Keontae Johnson, and I think the way they've adjusted has actually been probably much better than the people thought it would. So
LSU is the team I think we were both most concerned about because the Tigers had banked 1 win against a team that right now would be in the tournament, and that's against Arkansas. We have discussed that shaky resume, so that may not hold water at the end of the day. 2 games that can move the needle for the Tigers, and I don't really like the matchup in either one for them. One would be Tennessee, and the Vols can just defend you. And that's the one thing that LSU can't do. I don't think that is a great matchup for them. The other one, Arkansas. Arkansas can do a lot of the things that LSU does, and that one is in Fayetteville, where the Hogs have only lost once all year. Now, LSU wins both those games, and I think it's in. But even going 1-1, Blake, I think you leave yourself in position, depending on how those other games go. And maybe if you sweep the rest, you're okay on sheer volume of wins. And let's also talk about this too, okay? You don't really hurt yourself on a lot of nights. I mean, maybe if you lose to Vanderbilt or South Carolina, that does that. And by the way, LSU's got a chance to do that with the game against Vanderbilt. I don't like their chances to lose that one, but that's a stumble opportunity that could really hurt. Bottom line for me is that I think LSU, to feel really good heading into Nashville, needs to beat both Arkansas and Tennessee, or at least get one of them. If you don't, I have a hard time seeing a path there for them that does not involve a deep run in the SEC tournament, because you start to put resumes under the microscope. the later you go, and the quality wins are just not going to be there absent that.
Yeah, I think the one thing LSU has going for them, I guess, is that they outside of the Kentucky game, they don't really have any bad losses. But as we talked about with Arkansas, you got to win, so you got to beat some really good teams at some point too, and they don't have a lot of those on their schedule right now. So, yeah, I mean I don't know. Like I look at LSU, and they are in that last four buys range for Lenardi's bracket, and I wonder, based on how they play defense, like I don't know, man. Like they've still got games, against Tennessee, as we said, they've still got to play Auburn. Georgia offensively, we've seen what they can do at times. Arkansas the same way. Even Vanderbilt. Like I know that's LSU's going to be favored in that game, but it's like the way LSU plays defense. I don't know that you can trust them either when it comes to when they go out on the floor. Really, if you look at the way they play defense, the past, I don't know, several weeks and just how quickly that game changed against Texas Tech, like that's where things are for them. And I wonder, they're a good offensive team, but can they outscore everybody? And that's kind of what it's gotten to, is sometimes they just can't. And I'm very curious to see how they finish here, because they need to do more than just beat Mississippi State, which I think that's going to be a tough game. And we'll talk about that one on Wednesday, but I think that's going to be a tough game for LSU to win at Mississippi State. And I also think, again, you look at some of the matchups, I don't think Tennessee's a great matchup for them. And so they're by no means, when we talk about locks, LSU is not even close to a lock. They're one that I think we could see potentially playing their way out of this thing, but that they've got some ground to make up, and they really need to make the most of their opportunities against teams like Tennessee and Arkansas.
Do we know when Darius Days is coming back? I did not check for an update of that, but initially that was about a 2-week absence, I think, and we're a week in.
Yeah, let's see. I have a feeling, I mean, I would think that, if you're LSU, you probably think you're getting him back maybe for that game against Auburn, like on the 20th, which that's still a little ways away. And I think LSU still has to make up. They have to make up the Florida game, right? So they've got, I want to say, they play Mississippi State and Tennessee this week. And then I don't know where they're going to make up that. Maybe that's on the back end that they're going to make up that Florida game. But I know they've got that stretch where right now they play Tennessee on Saturday, and then they play Auburn the next Saturday. So they don't have a midweek game on their schedule as of right now for the following week. So I don't know if maybe that's something where they add a game somewhere, or something gets switched around, which I guess we don't even know, right? Because we've seen the SEC shift stuff around based on teams having to pause and all that. So there could still be games that get postponed or whatever. But I guess you would think that maybe there's a chance he could be back for Tennessee on Saturday, but I don't know the complete answer to that.
Well, and that's a good point on the canceled games. I didn't think to mention that. And one that I think Tennessee and Florida play each other, right?
That's
so
right. I
think
keep forgetting about that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that one will be made up at some point. So whoever wins that one, that just gets that team closer to stamping its tournament pass. I think the other one, it doesn't really hurt so much, barring a disaster in other games. So I don't see that as much of a factor. It might impact seeding by a line or two based on whoever wins that one. But yeah, I mean, LSU, back to the Tigers for a minute, Blake. Ken Palm has got LSU projected for 14-9 overall, 9-7 in the league at the end of the regular season. Again, that's without any makeup games. I just don't think that's going to be good enough. I think they've got to find a couple in there that they're not expected to get.
Yeah, I guess when you look at his projections, he has him, like I said, losing that game against Mississippi State, and then he's got the two losses to Tennessee and Arkansas, which I don't think they can afford to lose this game against Mississippi State on Wednesday. I think they've got to find a way to win that game, because if they don't, and you're going into that game against Tennessee on Saturday, kind of in a situation where you may be getting close to like must-win territory in a game like that, that could really boost your resume. I don't think you want to be in that spot if you're LSU. So getting Darius Days back will help. But I think the biggest thing that would help is them actually playing defense consistently, and I haven't seen that enough from them here over the past several weeks.
We are doing this on Tuesday morning. Only 3 games scheduled for this evening. One would be Alabama at South Carolina. Arkansas plays at Kentucky. Auburn at Vandy. I don't see a lot of implications in this for Alabama unless it were to lose at Carolina, which, Carolina's pattern is just when it lays a stinker, it comes back with a terrific effort. So I shouldn't underplay that one. Auburn Vandy doesn't mean anything. Auburn is not going to the SEC tournament. We'll get into that in just a minute. Vandy just trying to get out of having that Wednesday game, which I think is going to be really tough. So that one, you hate to call a game meaningless because it means something to the players and the coaches, but that one really does not have any ramifications for anybody. Arkansas at Kentucky, again, not one that moves the needle for Arkansas if it wins. And if you lose, that's a quad 2 loss. That really hurts you. But one you certainly need to get to do all you can to get in if you're the Razorbacks.
Yeah, that's the most meaningful game for sure. I think Arkansas, like we said, they really need to win this game. And the thing is it's crazy to think about. Like Arkansas really needs to win, but if they do win, like Kentucky is going to be 5-13, and it's just like as more of these losses continue adding up on Kentucky, I keep thinking, all right, surely they're not going to be 5-10. Oh, surely they're not going to be 5-11. Surely they're not going to be 5-12. Well, if they don't win this game, they're going to be 5-13, and that's hard to think about in terms of where the Cats are at right now, and not even factoring into this conversation. We just spent 30 minutes talking about the SEC, NCAA tournament prospects, and everything we said about Kentucky was, well, Kentucky's not going to help your resume at all. They're only going to hurt it, which is so crazy to think about. But Arkansas definitely needs to win this game, as we said, just based on their remaining schedule. They've got quality win opportunities left, but this is one where I feel like you don't want to drop. You don't want to start moving backward because then you put yourself in more of those must-win type of scenarios maybe in a couple weeks, and really needing those games against good competition, which you don't think you're going to go 4-0 against that group of four that we mentioned. So they need to win this one, but I'm curious to see, honestly. I think that's the biggest storyline of the night is how Kentucky, how do they bounce back? And I feel like we've said that so many times now, but I'm very curious to see what the Cats look like. Also, South Carolina. It's just, I don't know, man. I want to think Alabama is in a really good spot here, but this South Carolina team, I just don't think you ever know. And look, Chris, we brought it up too. Alabama has not played well over the past, a couple weeks now. So maybe this is a spot for South Carolina where you get an Alabama team. It's an early start. I'm always curious about those early starts because this one's at 6:30 Eastern, 5:30 Central, and I don't know. I'm a little curious about this game. I think Alabama should take care of business, but I never wonder. Sort of a Frank Martin team in this spot. I'm always curious to see how they play. So,
well, I'm looking at Carolina. And you could argue that it has followed its four worst performances of the year with the win. And case in point, starting the season, it loses by 16 to Liberty on a neutral floor. Now Liberty's a good team, 109 in Ken Palm. Maybe we can argue they're better than that. But point is, not a pushover. Come back the next week and beat Tulsa by 11. Okay, on the 6th, opens conference play with a 24-point loss to an A&M team that frankly hasn't been very good. Come back and lose by 5 at LSU. So doesn't win, but plays pretty well. Loses to Georgia by 24 at home a couple weeks ago. Beats Georgia by 24 at home, and then loses to Vandy in a game where, frankly, Carolina looked horrible. I saw that from start to finish. Then comes back and wins at Florida. Just when you think they've got some momentum, they pull a stinker and lose by 16 to MSU at home. So just, again, all over the board with that team. Alabama, that's one, certainly I think if you want to be in that 2 to 3 seed range at the end of things, that's one you don't want to lose because that's a quad 2 loss. And speaking of Kentucky, we called that a meaningless game, but here's the thing. I don't know how deep the tournament committee is going to dive into quad 1 wins, but if Arkansas gets one at Kentucky, Kentucky is 81 in the net rankings. That's only 6 from cracking the top 75. So that's one Arkansas could pick up that could end up being a quad 1 win if it's able to pull it off tonight.
Yeah, and I was just thinking too, I just realized looking at South Carolina's schedule, there are teams on their schedule that like they don't even have Kentucky on their schedule right now because I feel like that game got postponed somewhere along the way. As I said, it's so hard to keep up with who's gotten postponed and when they're going to be rescheduled and all that. So I assume South Carolina still has to play Kentucky too. It's crazy because we talked about it. It's like, Arkansas and all these other teams, like there are probably games on some of these schedules where it's like, I don't even realize that they're not there because it's so hard to keep up with some of the games been postponed. So big game for Arkansas. I mean, it is. I'm curious about it too from their perspective because if you look at Arkansas, they have not been great on the road. Like they have not played particularly well. Which can you really count the Vanderbilt game? I guess is one that again that you're playing against competition that's not to your level. And outside of that win against Auburn without Sharif Cooper back in December, Arkansas has what? They've gone 0-4 outside of that game against Vandy on the road. And quite frankly, I mean, they haven't necessarily played well in those games at LSU and Alabama. So I'm very curious to see kind of what Arkansas looks like on the road because they have to win some of these games, we said. And these next two with Kentucky and Missouri both on the road, I think this tells us a lot more about Arkansas moving forward.
Yeah, Arkansas is 1-5 against quad one competition, and that to me just screams not an NCAA tournament team. Now, maybe the team is good enough to be that, right? But in the end, the committee is going to judge you on what your resume says you are, and right now the resume says not NCAA tournament team.
Yeah, and that's what we said. I think you're certainly rooting for teams like North Texas and Conference USA, and I think Abilene Christian. I'm pulling it up now, but I know they're kind of running things in the Southland. They're tied at the top right now with Sam Houston State, so they're going to have to win the tournament to get in, but that's not going to be easy with Stephen F. Austin in there too. So I think you need to be rooting for those teams. Like we said, they're not really going to move the needle a whole lot, but you want to. You want to have wins over NCAA tournament teams on your resume, period. And so I think if you're Arkansas, you want to be rooting for all these teams you play in the non-conference because it wasn't a great non-conference schedule. And I don't completely blame Arkansas for that because, as we said, scheduling was a nightmare. But I think overall, you want to be rooting for teams like that, too, to eventually make their way into the dance.
The SEC has not made a public statement yet on rescheduling canceled games that I can recall hearing. Have you heard one?
I mean, they've said they're going to, I think they're just shifting games around for now. But the thing is, I feel like whenever they go to reschedule one, you have what we had this past weekend or whatever with Florida and LSU, and so we're shifting games and we're moving, games that maybe were supposed to be played, at the end of February, moving them up, and so I have no idea. It's impossible to keep up with, I think, because there are so many moving parts with this. But I don't know if I assume they're just going to build it into the back end of that schedule and try to do it that way. But I mean, look at a team like South Carolina, right? We talked about this. I mean, South Carolina still only played, 12 games at this point? And they've still got, like we said, they've got games that aren't even listed on their schedule right now that they still need to make up. So I don't know what the number ends up being for some of these teams, but my guess is certainly we're not going to see every SEC team play the same number of games.
Well, let's run down what we've got right now. I'm looking at Ken Palm. Alabama has played and is scheduled to play all 18 of its games. Missouri needs to get 2 at some point. Tennessee needs to get 2. Arkansas needs to get 1. Florida needs to get 2. LSU needs to get 2. Mississippi State has got all of its in so far and does not have a game canceled that I'm aware that's ahead. Ole Miss needs to get in 1. Georgia needs to get in 1. Kentucky needs to get in 2. And then when you get to the bottom of the standings, that's when you really find it tricky. Carolina's got to get in 3. Auburn is good with 18 so far. A&M's got 4 games to find.
Wow.
And Vandy's got 3. So now A&M and Vandy have had their 2 games against each other canceled. So I don't know how the league will treat that. If it'll just say, all right, you guys have got so much ground to make up. You play each other once, and let's concentrate. I know Vandy's got a game against Missouri to make up. And I think the other one, well, that's it. So 2 A&M and 1 Missouri. I don't know if the league in that case, but because frankly, look, I think at this point, Auburn's not going to be in the SEC tournament. So they've redone the bracket to the 12 and 13. Instead of having 2 games on Wednesday, you would usually have the 11 playing the 14 and the 12 playing the 13. The 11-14 game is no more. You have the 12-13 game will be the only game in Nashville to open the SEC tournament. Right now, I think Vandy and A&M are both going to have issues avoiding that game because everybody's got at least 3 wins in the conference. That includes South Carolina, which again has got some games to make up. Everybody else above South Carolina, in other words, 11 of the league's 14 teams have got at least 4 wins. Vandy's going to have a lot of trouble getting to that 4-win, 3-win threshold to get out of that game. A&M at 2-6 has got a little better chance, but it's going to be interesting to me to see what the league does with those 2 teams in particular, whether they just say, all right, your games against either each other don't mean much if things play out because you're both going to play in that play-in game anyway. Let's defer one of those games so that we make sure Vandy plays Missouri and A&M plays whoever else it needs to play. Or if it'll just say, hey, we're all going to play all the games, and you guys are just going to have to play a lot of games on short rest. I don't know how that resolves, but to me, the priority needs to be clearing up the seeding where it is muddy. And my goodness, if the seeding picture could get much muddier than this one, other than at the top and the very bottom, I would like to see an example of that.
I was just thinking too. I think if you're some of these teams that are playing to get into the NCAA tournament too, like you need some of these games to get made up because as we're going to talk about, I'm sure, which the discussion will get very intense, I think, as we get closer to the start of March. But like, what if there isn't an SEC tournament? Like, what if, I don't know. Like, what if some of these teams don't play? What if Alabama doesn't play? What if Missouri doesn't play? What if Tennessee doesn't play? And then let's say you're a team like LSU who's in that spot where you need to pick up quality wins. This is where I think you want to be able to kind of understand that maybe this regular season, which it always means something because that's how you're building your resume, but like some of these games are even more important with the potential that there may not be an SEC tournament or maybe some of these teams decide not to play in the tournament. I think there are a lot of unknowns with that. So I think that makes it more fascinating too if you're a bubble team, not knowing exactly if you will even get those opportunities in the SEC tournament. So that's why I think this stretch here, these 6-7 games, whatever you have left, even more important because you may not get those opportunities against the top teams should they decide that, hey, our seeding's safe. We're going to be a 2 seed, a 3 seed, a 4 seed, a 5 seed. There's no reason for us to go risk it by playing in a conference tournament and potentially having to forfeit our spot in the NCAA tournament. So that's another fascinating part of this, and it's just, it's pretty wild.
Do you really see it playing out like that teams will just choose to opt out of the tournament?
I mean, I'm telling you, look, here's why I would say that, because I think the NCAA, and I don't know the specific wording, I'd have to look it up, but like, I'm pretty sure the NCAA has said, hey, we realize that there is not a lot of wiggle room for us to be able to play this tournament. So if they have to, here's my question. If you get into, let's say, the first round of the NCAA tournament, and we know we're playing all this in Indianapolis, different locations, but we're playing in Indianapolis. And, if you just came off a conference tournament, and for some reason, all right, we got to go on pause right after the conference tournament. We're an NCAA tournament team. Well, we don't have that time. Like, where do we get? Our game can't get moved back because we already set to play. NCAA is playing the first round this time, second round this time, Sweet 16, and so forth. I don't think they can shift all that around the way that maybe they could in a different scenario. And so I think that is something that these teams are going to have to think about if the current situation is in place where you have to pause for a certain amount of time. And we've said it so many times, like some of these programs around the country are still struggling to get to the 13, 14 game mark because they paused 2 or 3 times. I don't know, man. Do you take that risk? If you're a team like Alabama who's having a memorable historical season, or Missouri or teams like that, that's my question, because I don't know that if you're that team, and I get it, it's about competition and all this other stuff, but if you get to the SEC tournament and all of a sudden, let's say you just played, and I don't know, whoever, Team A, Team B, and 2 days later, it's like, well, Team A or Team B is in the protocol. Well, guess what? You're probably about to be in the protocol too. And so I don't know. I think that's going to be a discussion that's much deeper than people think it's going to be, because I really could see that scenario playing out. And I don't know. We talked about the consequences too. If you decide not to play in your conference tournament, do you say, all right, well, that automatically is going to drop you a seed line? Well, if you're Alabama, you're a 2 seed. If it drops you to a 3 seed, is that significant enough to be able to say, all right, I could potentially have to give up my spot? I don't know, man. I think it's going to be tricky. I really do.
Well, that sets up, in my mind, for a nightmare scenario. And let me give it to you right here, okay? Let's say that Alabama, Missouri, Tennessee, Florida all say, all right, we've done all we need to do. We're getting in the tournament, right?
Yep.
Let's say that Arkansas or LSU, one of those teams, it's probably bubbled in, going into Nashville, decides the same thing. Well, let's say you go through the tournament and a team like an Ole Miss or Mississippi State that's not going to get in based on what we think will happen. No, one of those teams might play their way in between now and then. I'm not trying to rule that out. But just for example's sake, let's say that somebody like those teams, or a Georgia, which is way off the bubble, goes through and in a weekend, you know,
Yep.
8-team SEC tournament field wins.
Yep.
Well, that's going to take a large spot away from somebody, right?
Right.
How does the committee do that? Does it start penalizing leagues and say, hey, we're looking at you, LSU, somebody's going to get a bid stolen. You chose not to play in your tournament. You're going to lose it. Now, I
Yep.
know that gets tricky when we're talking about a pandemic and public safety and health, but frankly, Blake, decisions have got to be made on some criteria. I don't know. To me, I'm against teams opting out of the tournament just because I think it's going to cause a lot of problems. I'm not going to say that, if you think safety and everything is concerned, that you have to play both. In other words, I don't know that I'd go as far if I'm Greg Sankey to say that, okay, if you don't play in the SEC tournament, you don't play in the NCAA either, because I think the point of what you would be trying to do in that scenario is make sure all your teams and all the players on those teams don't have a lot of negative tests that cost them in the big dance. But it does create a very dicey situation where it could allow teams to opt out for whatever number of reasons. But then in a weakened field where the top teams don't play, it really devalues the conference tournament. But the automatic bid is the automatic bid, and you get in anyway, and somebody has to pay for that on the other side by losing in a large bid. That is, to me, the nightmare that I see potentially coming under the scenario that you think is possible.
Well, and I just had to look this up because I remember this conversation was had the 1st of January when the NCAA started announcing kind of what things were going to look like. And basically what they said was talking about, potential of having to replace teams, potentially having to move around dates and all that stuff. Would teams have to forfeit? Will games be rescheduled? I think that and this is what points out in kind of some of the stuff that was talked about, if they say that we are going to stick to that schedule that we have and we are not going to have the flexibility to move things around, you almost certainly, I think, are going to be looking at scenarios where you're either going to have to decide, okay, is the team going to have to forfeit? What are we going to do? And are we going to replace teams? Like, I don't know how in the world you would replace, right? Like, how could you do that if you say, okay, even if, I don't know, see, because that's the thing too. It's like, the more I think about this, I'm like, they have to figure this out quickly. Like, I feel like there has to be some sort of clarity sooner rather than later because we're here in the 1st of February, right? And I mean, unless I've missed something, I don't think there is any just strict outline on what their plan is at this point. And so I'm very curious. I'm with you. I hope it's not a situation where we see that, where, we don't look at that and say, all right, well, all of a sudden 3 SEC teams have decided not to play, because that does open up the situation where what if you're a mid-major conference? And, I don't know. There's a lot of questions about this, and I think the NCAA, there has to be some more clarity in terms of what they're going to do. So I'm very curious to see if we get that clarity, because if not, I feel like we're setting up for a pretty big mess here once we get to the start of March.
So have they ruled out the idea of moving back any of the NCAA tournament?
Well, I think that was the thing, and that's what I remember specifically was that I think they had stressed, and I could completely be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure they stressed that we are going to stick to that timeline that we have. And look, my thing is the reason they're doing that because of all these different venues that they're having to play in. Is it just going to be a matter of availability in terms of, okay, well, if we move this thing back 2 or 3 weeks, are we going to have the same availability? Which I'm sure there are ways around that. But I think from what I've heard is that, they're basically saying, we want to be able to stick to the current timeline that we have. Now, I'm sure there has to be some sort of flexibility with that. But even then, my question is, if one team gets put in that situation, are you going to move the whole NCAA tournament back 2 weeks or a week or whatever? I don't know if they do that for one team or 2 teams. It's just, I don't know. I think this is going to be tricky. I think we knew it was going to be tricky no matter what. But there are already lots of conversations about people and what they're going to do. I know I heard, who was it? I think it was Mick Cronin was on John Rothstein's podcast and was basically talking about, hey, I don't know that they're completely comfortable in terms of playing this Pac-12 tournament and all this other stuff. So I think some of these conference tournaments and what we wind up getting from them are going to be very interesting to see how this thing plays out.
Well, This is why I don't like that decision, Blake, because if that's your concern and you're giving teams a pass out of the conference tournament, A, you weaken the tournaments as I've been over,
Yeah.
but B, you already have the built-in problem of sample size, right? A
Yep.
lot of teams got a lot of meaningful conference out of conference games canceled, and again, some conference games canceled that may not be made up. So you're already trying to pick a field based on a lower sample size, which is, I think, always better to have more of a body of work to where you can make judgments on teams. So now what you have done by setting that in stone, if that's what they do, is you've given some teams a pass out of the conference tournament. If that's your concern, put a buffer between the conference tournaments and the NCAA tournament to where now nobody has the excuse not to play a conference tournament. You've got a couple weeks to get over things. You can't say, oh, well, gee, we went to Nashville and then we got COVID and now we can't play the NCAA tournament. To me, that takes the excuse away. Now, here's what I think the reason is they can't do this, okay? Guess what starts April the 5th?
Yep. Right.
The Masters.
Yep.
So now you're competing with that on the weekends. If you don't get this thing in, I think that's probably the hang up, and maybe there's no way around it. But I just hate the way this whole thing has played out that way, because I think if it plays out in the nightmare scenario that we are discussing here, where a lot of teams just opt out for different reasons, I just think it makes it harder to seed an accurate field. I think it provides for a weaker field where more teams win conference tournaments and steal bids from large teams. And I just think quality of product on the whole is going to be affected adversely. And look, maybe it's not fair to criticize the NCAA. I'm not even saying that necessarily I am. I'm just saying that it's less than ideal the way that I look at how all these factors work together and play out.
Here's an article I found from Mike DeCourcy at Sporting News, and I knew there was one I was trying to think of that was more recent than the early January one, but the fact was that the NCAA has basically stressed to teams, that if they're playing in their conference tournament, to basically stay in their city, that is wherever they're playing the conference tournament, until it's decided on where they're going to play in Indianapolis and all this other stuff. So basically not to travel back to wherever they're supposed to be. So they want them to stay there, and then I assume immediately go from there to Indianapolis to wherever they're going to be, staying and all that kind of stuff. And one of the quotes in this article is the fact that, Chris Mack was one of the ones that talked about it from Louisville. And his quote was, I do believe there will be some teams that opt out of conference tournaments knowing they're a shoo-in for the NCAA tournament. And then he said, I would consider it. It probably wouldn't be my decision alone. He said that'd be a hell of a choice. So, I really think you're going to have these conversations that are already being had, probably from the teams more towards the top than maybe the teams that are in the middle, because they know they may need the conference tournament. But I don't know. I think there has to be something surely we're going to get something from the NCAA in the next couple weeks that really completely outlines what this is going to be. Because like you said, if all of a sudden a Georgia wins the SEC tournament, that opens up a much more bigger conversation, because you're going to have a lot of angry people, I think, in other places if Alabama, Tennessee, and Missouri don't play, teams like that. Maybe the second best team in the SoCon, or places like that, who wind up getting knocked out, and this other. It's going to be a mess. But I think we knew it was going to be challenging no matter what. But I think the more you look at it logistically, it's maybe even more challenging than probably we wanted to admit on the surface.
Well, and of course, the SEC operates within the bigger context, and this is where decisions get complicated too. I'm looking. We keep an eye on Belmont because, again, we do this out of the Nashville area. Belmont is in Nashville. So that's a program we keep our eyes on. That's a team that's 68 in the net this morning. But I pointed to sample size, right? Belmont would normally have some games against some teams that would be opportunities for quad one wins out of conference. Well, Belmont didn't have that this year. The OVC also started conference play earlier. And Belmont's sitting there at 19-1, but 68 in the net rankings. What happens if you're the selection committee? Let's say Belmont runs the table. The net's not going to go up a lot because of the other teams in the conference aren't going to move the needle. Let's say it loses in its conference tournament to any number of teams that are good enough to win it, an Austin P, an Eastern Kentucky, someone like that. What do you do with a 20-whatever-2 Belmont team that goes to its conference tournament, loses that game, and then you've got, again, hypothetically, a bubble team in a Power Five league that sits it out or whatever based on concerns for safety. I just think that, again, it's layers upon layers of complication when you get into these things, and I just hate the way that it is playing out potentially.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's I don't know how it's going to play out. And I mentioned Mick Cronin at UCLA, and that's another kind of draw a comparison to kind of where the things stand for the Pac-12. They're they basically said, hey, we're playing our tournament, and I was reading a story from the Salt Lake Tribune, which has the I think it's the Utah athletic director, Mark Harlan, is basically saying that the importance of having a conference tournament and talking about the NCAA requirements, having those 7 days of clean tests, and then being able to be in the bubble in Indianapolis. All those other things. I don't know. I'm very curious to see where things go because, like we said, I think you probably look at it, and I don't know. I think that this is going to be a discussion we're having for a while in terms of what these teams decide to do, because I feel like it's one where I really do believe if you're Gonzaga, like you're having literally one of the greatest seasons in the history of college basketball, you could be one of the greatest teams in the history of the game. And what do you do about going and playing in the West Coast Conference Tournament in a league that BYU's probably getting in? But outside of that, what, I don't know. Like, man, I think there's a lot of logistical things that we still got to figure out on this.
Blake, any more thoughts on the NCAA bubble or anything that we have talked about that we need to put a bow on here?
Well, the only thing I'll say is I'm glad we are doing the 14 podcast and not having to be in the NCAA room right now making these decisions. How about that? We made a better career choice, I think, by doing this. So
I'm into that. Well, let's close with a non-tournament related thought. And again, I said that Auburn and Vanderbilt was basically a meaningless matchup, but I'll tell you what'll be fun. Sharif Cooper and Scottie Pippen Jr. in some ways are probably the most similar players in terms to how they're used. They both have I think, top 5 in the country usage rate. No, Cooper there is not there yet in KenPom because he hasn't played enough games, but 2 scoring point guards who dish out a lot of assists and use an inordinate number of teams' possessions. And I think Cooper's the better player. But tonight, that'll be fun to watch those 2 kids face off.
Yeah, agreed. I think there'll be some points put up on the board in that one, be my guess. So I don't know what the over-under is, but I'm feeling good about the over without even knowing what the number is. I think they're going to put up some points. So
yeah, neither team's forte is defense.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Well, with that, Blake, you and I will wrap up this episode of the 14. Again, we are going to tease some baseball coverage. I think that's going to come Friday. We'll have a major announcement on this podcast that I think you will be very excited about as it relates to our baseball coverage. We will have a couple more podcasts the next couple of days. We will discuss on Wednesday the events of Tuesday night, and on Thursday the events of Wednesday night. And then Friday, we will get into more of our baseball coverage. And with that, Blake, I know we are in the process of getting our podcast up and on the feeds. We've got a few things up. We've got a few more things pending. But tell folks where they can get the podcast and subscribe, where they can follow us on Twitter, and any other way that they can stay in tune with what we are doing here at the 14.
Yeah, the Twitter feed's up at 14 Southeastern, so you can check that out there. It's all over both of our individual Twitter feeds also, so you can find us there. I know Chris is at ChrisLee70. I'm at the Blake Lovell. You can find the links to our Twitter feed on that, and we're on Spotify now. The podcast's already up on Spotify, so you can find it on there. You can search for either the 14, you can search for Southeastern 14, whichever. You'll be able to find it that way, so you can find it on Spotify. Should be on Apple Podcasts. My guess is Wednesday or Thursday, so if you're someone who, I know a lot of people listen through that, you can find it on there, and then it'll be spread out to all the other podcast outlets from there, so should have everything up on there. My guess is by the end of the week. So yeah, you can check everything out with that. And yeah, it's a lot of exciting stuff we have on the way here. We might even get one of my bracketologist friends on for Thursday, and we talked a lot of bracketology today, but I think it'd be good to get some insight into kind of what the thinking is from people who do this for a living. So that'll be a lot of fun too. And as you said, the baseball stuff, that's going to be really exciting. Baseball season's almost here. It's hard to believe.
All right, for Blake Lovell, I am Chris Lee. Thank you for listening to the 14 again. Be sure and listen Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, as we have more episodes of the podcast coming in.